Said it was the wrong thing for me to do. I said it's just a boy's game, but girls play too. My heart is working overtime in this kind of game. People get hurt. I'm thinking that the people is me. If you wanna find me, I'll be playing with the boys. Playing with the boys. After chasing sunsets, one of life's simple joys is playing with the boys. Hey everybody, my name is Ian Garcia, this is Devotional Criticism, and welcome back to the New Movie Diary. This is a cinema criticism series in which I review recent, new, and up-and-coming film releases and attempt to give you the straight facts about them in my humble opinion. Another exciting week of new releases, and for me personally, it was a tough call making a decision as to what I was going to end up seeing in the lead up to the last weekend. Personally, I've had my eye on at least 4 of these movies, these new releases. I found myself really very much interested in seeing The Feeling That the Time for Doing Something Has Passed, very word salady title, written, directed by, and starring Joanna Arnau. This would be Arnau's debut with a feature fiction film following her documentary I Hate Myself from all the way back in 2013. There was also Nowhere Special, Uberto Pasolini's latest film, which is finally seeing its limited US release courtesy of the Cohen Media Group, even after having premiered all the way back in 2020 at the Venice Film Festival. And then there's finally Terrestrial Verses by Ali Asghari and Alireza Khatami, a really exciting but also harrowing-looking social and political drama that proved to be a major temptation to make me make another commute to the big city for a chance to see it. But I hope my viewers won't mind terribly if I decided to stick a little closer to home in hopes of taking in what I was expecting to be the lighter fare among the major releases for this week, which, considering my recent penchant for all things either visceral or sensual, shouldn't have so surprisingly drawn me out for the earliest Thursday preview of Challengers at my local multiplex. Challengers is, of course, the latest feature film from director Luca Guadagnino, an Italian filmmaker who's been working since the late 90s, but who really only came to major international prominence rather recently in what I think, as far as further West and English-speaking audiences, we often neglect to acknowledge in a way how recent his rising star has been. From that vantage point, I think it's fair to say that even for the most cineasty of us cineasts, it was really only in 2017 with the queer coming-of-age adaptation Call Me By Your Name and the critical darling that it became that Guadagnino really penetrated international film lover consciousness, and pretty much immediately after that he set himself up for a just as much of an ignominious fall from grace, or at least a severe polarization of his new mass foreign audience when he followed up Call Me By Your Name with an audacious remake of the Italian horror classic Suspiria. Now, I personally found myself really rather fond of Guadagnino's Suspiria, and ironically probably had a much more pronounced charismatic feeling towards it as Guadagnino's unveiling of himself as a new filmmaker to me than, by comparison, the rather light to an almost unbearably light degree that was Call Me By Your Name. But it's impossible to not find the knocks against Suspiria to be anything less than justified, regardless of whether or not you're coming at it from the vantage of persistent comparison to the original film by Dario Argento. For a lot of audiences, and this really continued with the HBO miniseries We Are Who We Are and Guadagnino's sort of genre art house blending follow-up to Suspiria with Bones and all, I feel like for a lot of this new, bigger audience, Guadagnino really cemented himself way too early in their minds with a kind of pretense of critical acclaim acclaim that he never really had until Call Me By Your Name, as well as with an outsized presentment of technical mastery that you would have needed to make something like this remake, or rather his inspiration from Suspiria, come off as anything more than a kind of tired exercise in both chomping at the reputation of a very much beloved classic of lavish, surreal horror, and then doing everything in a way that is so countervailing to what the original film was that it ironically makes this new mass audience that you have more suspicious that you are more of a superficial dilettante. That ironically, the fact that you took so few lessons from Argento's original film while at the same time attempting to advance your creative career on its back, that you took so few lessons from it that you actually make your own work seem more creatively shallow, like you're only doing something different to be different. You're not actually being different authentically. It's a performance of originality. And look, I'm only harping on Suspiria to the extent that I still see people who, when they see a new Guadagnino project coming up, keep going back to Suspiria. It's clearly this thing that really has gotten under people's skin. For as many people who really quite like Suspiria or who were more blasé on it, there's a lot of people who really hated it, and it has like completely defined their perception and expectations of a Guadagnino movie, even though in terms of Guadagnino's career up to this point, Suspiria really is an outlier, except for maybe Bones and All after it. He really didn't do a lot of stuff like that before, and he doesn't really seem to be expecting to do much like it after. And of course, right now, I'm as guilty as anybody of constantly recycling back to Suspiria, but let's be real about this. Again, this is coming from someone who actually really quite liked the 2018 Suspiria, or Nuspiria, as I'm fond of calling it. I liked it. I liked its strange aesthetic drabness. I liked Guadagnino's tendency to look at parts of the scene or scenery in this almost Margaret Tate like way where he eschewed the more obvious landscape or exterior shots that are more conventional in a historical or period piece. I like a lot of how he sort of observed the setting through small components. I liked how much it went for a more subdued sense of the bizarre in that way. And, you know, more especially than anything, I really loved how politically serious his and David Kajanich's writing of the film was. The way it sort of latched on to what was really just kind of the contemporary, unconsidered setting in West Germany in the original film, and brought that to life as a driving motive behind the horror and spectacle of the story. And to put a sharper point on it, as far as the wave of so-called elevated horror, I vastly preferred the political horror of Nuspiria to the prevailing trend of cheap psychological cliches that so many of Guadagnino's contemporaries tend to lean upon as a crutch and still lean upon. But that being said, I also totally get the argument about Guadagnino's superficiality, and despite how much I enjoyed Nuspiria, I must confess that I couldn't look at the advertisements for We Are Who We Are and then Bones and All and not have this really visceral rejection and trepidation that really didn't quite measure up to how fond I was of Nuspiria in the first place. Because, you know, I couldn't help watching the publicity for Bones and All and everything I was seeing from it and come to the conclusion that I didn't really feel like I was watching anything more than a commercial. And of course, I was watching a commercial. I was watching a commercial for a film, but that was the thing. There is this kind of affect to Guadagnino's recent output that has made it feel like a commercial, for a kind of astroturfed presentiment of him as this really exciting new international voice in filmmaking, and not as basically a fashion dilettante. And that's really far from accidental, because besides his rather successful filmmaking career, Guadagnino really has been a forceful auteur in probably no other field more demonstrative than in ad campaigns, especially fashion campaigns, whether we're talking about his work for Cartier or Giorgio Armani or Fendi, or most recently with Salvatore Ferragamo. This is a guy who it's not just like he's kept one foot in an art house film sphere and one foot in the world of advertisement. You can see it very much in the sensuality and muted lushness of his own works, where the influence of a cinematic artistic consciousness and a more fashion-minded artistic consciousness really bleeds over into one another. And that's not intended as a knock against fashion or whatever, but it does sort of project this sense of Guadagnino being a filmmaker who is perhaps more considerate of the fashionability of his works. And in that regard, his movies are very pretty, but their obsession with fashionability as a vehicle only makes them sort of less what a fashionistic movie should be, which is fashion forward. It seems like his movies are kind of fashion regressive. They're almost downstream of their ideals of how formalism and sensuality and aesthetics can define and build up an image and enhance a story. Because even if he's an artist seeking that fashionableness, that appreciation of the elegancy of forms as a vehicle for something else in terms of character or narrative, there is that persistent tension in his works that you can see in this very balanced visual style he's developed over the years, beginning with I Am Love, but especially since his collaboration with cinematographer Sayumbu Mukdiprom, beginning with Call Me By Your Name, where his composition of shots is often pretty and complimentary of its subject, but rarely very picturesque, where it's shot in the daytime. If it's shot in the daytime, it's shot at times and in locales where the lighting is really harsh and bright so that it washes out a lot of the contrast and leaves you with this very soft image where the saturation tends to be with very mild colors, even simply white or beige, and which, to my mind at least, almost feels like a catalog brought to life, almost feels like you could literally be looking in the pages of a magazine where the content is primarily this very mild selling you of something. Where the point of a catalog photography or a fashion advertisement is precisely that you want something that's eye-catching, but you don't want it to be so dynamic that it distracts from the popular content of the fashion itself. The image can be pretty, but if it's too dynamic, it's going to distract from you really focusing on what the person is wearing, what the model is doing, what complements the model, and not simply the image of the model. Guadagnino's movies very much feel like that, and in like kind, it almost feels like he's created this kind of, not even like a high-end fashion magazine aesthetic, but almost like a downstream, off-the-rack fashion aesthetic, like an R.L. Bean fashion aesthetic, like a J.C. Penney fashion aesthetic in his movies. Which brings us, in my typically roundabout and extemporaneous way, to Challengers, which in one of its earliest scenes literally features star Zendaya going over and making notes on an advertising campaign in which she's going to be featured, and it almost feels like Guadagnino inching up to the line of commenting upon himself and his vision as a filmmaker, almost like we're finally getting a Guadagnino film that doesn't simply have a kind of catalog look, but we're finally entering into the world of that catalog, and where now you find this strange, warped, perverse psychosexuality to it. Challengers stars Zendaya alongside Mike Feist and Josh O'Connor. Josh O'Connor previously showed up on the new movie diary for our last entry on Elise Rohrwacher's La Chimera. The three of them respectively play Tashi, Zendaya, Art, Feist, and Patrick O'Connor. Now, our story begins in the summer of 2019 with Art and Patrick in the heated final match of an ATP Challenger competition. Tashi watching seriously from the sidelines, intense gazes exchanged between everybody, and the story is presented non-linearly, with much of the dramatic structure of the narrative being organized around this match as power balances shift and we learn more and more of the backstory and forming upon and revealing mostly more salacious details about the backgrounds of these characters and their relationships. Basically, in the present of 2019, Tashi and Art are a big-time pro sports power couple. They're married, with Tashi serving as Art's coach and his manager and agent. They have a daughter together, but behind the facade of their professional and financial success, their marriage comes off as very visibly estranged, lacking in closeness or passion. Art has been recovering from an injury, but it's clear that there's something more psychological going on behind his eyes, a deep malaise that Guadagnino actually does something very interesting with in order to illustrate, which is that as he's leading up to the big flashback, to taking us back to the true beginning of this story, the origin of the antagonism between Art and Patrick, as he's building up to that, there are several points, especially when Art is left briefly alone, that the opening theme by Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross kicks in, and it has this really sensual, driving techno rhythm and deep, somewhat dark house ambience. But it'll be interrupted or cut prematurely, almost as if the music itself, just in the way Guadagnino is editing it into the scenes more as a stark punctuation than a real accompaniment, it almost signifies what lies behind the malaise in Art and Tashi's marriage, though it must be said, especially Art's malaise and longing and yearning for something that he constantly, when he's alone, he finds himself recoiling back into, but then he's interrupted and suddenly the soundtrack stops. Finally, though, we do flash back to 2006 with the teenage Art and Patrick as a boys' junior double in the US Open, which they win handily, and they're both very close friends. They've known each other since 12 years old in boarding school, and after winning their title, Patrick is really eager to take Art to the girls' junior singles because he knows that a very talented prospect named Tashi Duncan is playing. They go to Tashi's match. This is both their first time seeing her play in person, and basically from the instant Tashi walks onto the court, these guys are bawled over by her. They're lounging dumbstruck in their seats, just watching her, absolutely enraptured, and basically very visibly being turned on by not just her, but her playing specifically. But we also learn a little bit more about the rather queer relationship between Art and Patrick themselves. There's a particular moment where Tashi fires this shot at her opponent and both boys jolt forward, and as they're doing that, Patrick immediately grabs for Art's bare knee, and there's a nice close-up to punctuate that at that moment where they're the most aroused by something Tashi is doing, Patrick's immediate instinct is to physically grab Art in this very vulnerable, naked, tender area, and in this very dominant, very assertive way. At first, before making plans to finally meet Tashi at a party being held to celebrate her own win, there seems to be a very clear power dynamic between Patrick and Art. Patrick is the more authoritative and confident one, and also the better tennis player. It's made a particular point of emphasis that Art has never won a match against Patrick, and that Art, by contrast, is more timid and introverted. But then they finally do meet at Tashi's party, and the dynamic changes very interestingly, where we see Patrick really trying too hard and embarrassing himself, and knowing he's embarrassing himself, really being dejected and lacking in optimism, almost self-sabotaging in a way, like he wants Tashi, but he doesn't really want her because part of him thinks that she's like too good for him. Whereas Art is suddenly more determined, seems to be more comfortable in his own skin around Tashi, which immediately makes Tashi more attracted to him. All of this culminates in the boys succeeding in getting Tashi to meet them back at their hotel room later that night, where Tashi senses rather immediately the sort of unrequited queer energy between these two guys, where she even gets them talking about an early sexual experience they had together where Patrick taught Art how to masturbate as boys, again with Patrick sort of reassuming this very dominant role in the friendship, almost undermining and compromising Art, but at the same time both of them insisting that they were thinking about the same girl when they were doing this together. Tashi gets them to come to the bed with her. She starts by kissing them each individually, then getting them all to kiss at the same time, and then she lies back in bed as Patrick and Art keep kissing and watches them with this really honestly rather troubling and wicked smile across her face before before Patrick and Art realize that Tashi has stopped kissing them, or rather realize that they've forgotten completely about her being there. And Tashi stops the encounter before it escalates. She says she's not a home wrecker. In other words, whatever it is these guys have going on, she doesn't intend to get into the middle of it or even be a part of it. She's not trying to be the bridge between these two straight guys who really want to be with each other more than anything else. Still, Patrick and Art are insistent, and they both want her number, and so she says she'll give it to whoever wins the boys' junior single match between them the following day. And so commences exactly what Tashi basically forewarns about, but comes to fruition partly because she's also a dumb teenager who's kind of into this scandalous battle of sexual and romantic wills. Basically, as the match continues between Patrick and Art in the present day of 2019, and as we see the power imbalance exchanged between them, we also watch these changes in power unfold over the course of their lives, as first Patrick is in a relationship with Tashi, and his career is on the rise, and then they break up and Art worms his way in, and Patrick's career declines as Art begins to ascend at the same time, etc., etc. And while in summary that may sound like material for a very cool, tense, romantic sports drama, I hope that I made it clear enough in that without spoiling too much of anything that Challengers isn't really a terribly romantic picture. If anything, from the unrequited queer chemistry between Patrick and Art to that incredibly devious, even somewhat insane Cheshire Cat smile that stretches across Tashi's face when she seduces these two guys into forgetting her, ironically, for her own amusement, Challengers is primarily a surprisingly sinister movie, and while there are elements of the erotic, that erotic tendency is something that leans more towards the sheerly perverse, even the kind of paraphilic. I suppose now is as good a time as any to mention that if you're hoping to see a really hot movie in which Zendaya has steamy love scenes with Josh O'Connor and Mike Feist, maybe perchance even a threesome, you're out of luck. The thing about Challengers is that the romantic angle of a love triangle, so to speak, taking place over a number of years, and the erotic tension that is built inherently into that, the thing about it is that just like with those stark cuts on the soundtrack to the Reznor-Ross score, only for it to be interrupted suddenly, the prevailing feeling of Challengers is of an erotic disappointment. Which is to say, there is a lot of erotic tension, there's a lot of build-up to love scenes, but there's actually no love scenes that go beyond simply making out. All of that intensity gets channeled in one of two directions. The first, the most obvious, is tennis. This long, sweaty, physically exhausting, intense exchange between Art and Patrick that drags on with Tashi in the middle, the kind of bridge for their erotic energy, the thing that is giving it purpose. But then there's also literally just arguments. There's literally just intense disputes, especially between Tashi and Patrick, that in their own weird way take the place of sex almost because their attachment styles are already so independent and thus inherently kind of combative when they meet, which is then, of course, contrasted with Art's more intimate, more conciliatory, more conflict-averse style that attracts Tashi more at first, but ends up in and of itself really disappointing her erotically. Challengers isn't a romantic movie, really. It's an erotic film, but it's an erotic film in this very perverse paraphilic sense where, honestly, if I wasn't already so inclined to compare the duality of Art and Patrick to the twins portrayed by Jeremy Irons in David Cronenberg's Dead Ringers, honestly, the movie I'm most inclined to compare a movie like Challengers to is Top Gun, right? Challengers is like the Top Gun of tennis movies, and quite frankly, considering how much of Reznor and Ross's original score sounds so obliquely like something Giorgio Moroder or Harold Faltermeyer might have composed in the mid-'80s, I'm not entirely sure that the thematic comparison isn't totally intentional. But with Top Gun, there's the template postmodern film in which there's all this brimming homoerotic tension, all of this this canoodling romance between Cruise and McGillis's characters, but where it's all expurgated by these driving, thrusting images of F-14A Tomcats screaming through the heavens, by this paraphilia for flying itself as something that you need to resolve all of those repressed, unmentionable desires. Like, if the message of Top Gun is that no woman on Earth will ever do it for you like the finest piece of hardware that the US Navy has to offer, taking you through the heavens, then the message of Challengers is that even with Zendaya, who also served as a producer on the film, even with her framed as basically like this siren-like force whose undeniable animal charisma draws men into her and destroys their bonds with other men, and when they lose her, sabotages them spiritually. Even that goddess can never, in the context of this movie, compare to the feeling of a really tight match between a man and his best friend, who is really also his arch nemesis, where far from the competition being a pretext for achieving Zendaya, Zendaya is just the pretext for the paraphilic thrill of that competition between these two guys, of taking out their rackets and knocking balls back and forth really, really hard. Kenny Loggins wrote a song about something like this. I don't know. I don't know if you've heard of it. And I could see why a lot of people would be disappointed by that, feel like it's kind of a bait and switch, kind of this weird attempt to take an R-rated concept and try fruitlessly to make it PG-13, but I really quite liked it, and for primarily the reason that I think Guadagnino has finally found an excellent fit for his catalog aesthetic here. There was a moment immediately after seeing the movie that I would have been more inclined to say that I thought that despite really great performances by all three of the principals, that the leads were too broadly drawn, where it felt almost too much like they were memes brought to life or something. The screenwriter for this was a guy named Justin Kuritzkis, and besides being allegedly a novelist and playwright, he's really most famous for two reasons. One, he's married to Celine Song, the writer and director of Past Lives, and two, basically the most high-profile thing he's ever done besides write Challengers was back in 2011, where he did this improvisational comedy video called Potion Seller that went viral.
Potion Seller, I'm telling you, I need your strongest potions. I'm going into battle. I'm going to battle and I need your strongest potions. You can't handle my strongest potions.
And I didn't know that going into Challengers, but I did have a very distinct feeling when I first was watching it that, you know, despite the fact that most of it takes place before the dawn of social networking and viral media as we know it, the characters just felt so much like they were born from the imaginary of an internet-poisoned incel mind, you know? Where despite the principals seemingly being able to find their characters and deliver these really believable performances, the content of what's on the page just still left a little to be desired for me, because it seemed a little too much like the characters were just drawn too thinly around their behavior and not really a sense of what attracts them to each other or what attracts them to a certain kind of relationship, aside from, again, this very memeified and almost incel-y construction of them, like Zendaya kind of being like this totemic embodiment of the hot woman who is way out of your league, who really is initially more attracted to art, or at least recognizes his good qualities, but because he's a simp, he ends up getting cucked, and she ends up going to Patrick, even though he's a dick, etc., etc. But the more I think about it, the more I see this as being basically the perfect culmination of Guadagnino's development of his living catalog aesthetic, to do something that isn't just dealing in namby-pamby themes of desire that is easily consumed by bourgeois audiences, but is never really very sexy, or gay movies that get rave reviews and ignite this sudden elevation in a guy's career just because he managed to make another gay movie that straight people all agreed was very good because they felt like it wasn't gay enough that it made them uncomfortable or like they weren't a part of it. Instead, Challengers is a really satisfyingly trashy movie, one where that living catalog aesthetic really does perfectly complement the content, which is simultaneously so strangely sexless or even asexual, and yet also so deeply perverted at the same time. In fact, I might even go so far as to resurrect that Cronenberg comparison, because aesthetically and content-wise, it might not be as daring in terms of going all the way sexually as a Cronenberg would, but there's definitely elements of Challengers that I found very much reminiscent of something like, say, Maps to the Stars. And it's honestly exactly the sort of thing that, as someone who really liked Guadagnino's film that most polarized everybody immediately after he got big, this is basically exactly what I think he should be doing. Basically just trying to remind everybody, that he's not this fashion dilettante. He's not this bougie, safe for straights queer filmmaker. Okay, he's not just those things, but he also has a really perverse, weird streak in his projects that he's attracted to. And I think Challengers is something that even folks who, up until now, have not been terribly fond of his work could actually really be something they get into. Whereas I'm really sorry for all of those folks going out to see the sexy Zendaya love triangle movie who end up instead getting this bizarre, paraphilic, late Cronenbergian drama where the people in the story are more turned on by tennis and yelling at each other than they are by each other. Anyway, I think that it was pretty dang good for the scandalous piece of work it was, and once again, well acted. I would say a new career highlight film score for Reznor and Ross. I love how crazily in tune it is to very specific eras of disco and techno and house music, to a degree where there are times when you're listening to the music and you could swear this must be a needle drop, because nothing sounds this much like I Feel Love unless it was something that came out when I Feel Love hit it big. I'm going to give this a pretty enthusiastic recommendation. I'm giving Challengers a 3.5 out of 5. With that, I'm going to wrap it up. Don't forget to comment, like, share, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this was the New Movie Diary. I'm going to catch you guys next time.